Hello and welcome. This is the first episode in a series on the history of Serbia and the Serbian people. This episode offers a condensed overview of the history of the peoples who inhabited the territory of modern-day Republic of Serbia during prehistory and antiquity, before the arrival of Serbs and other Slavs to the Balkan Peninsula in the 6th and 7th centuries AD. We will be taking a look at the history of these peoples for two reasons. Firstly, while they no longer exist in the cultural sense, the current inhabitants of the Balkans, Serbs included, trace their descent from them, as historical migrations typically resulted in the merging of indigenous populations with newcomers. Secondly, in their struggle to survive as distinct groups, these peoples faced many challenges that Serbs have had to grapple with ever since they settled in the Balkans. These challenges are primarily the result of the Balkan Peninsula's position as a bridge between Europe and the Middle East. The potential to control trade and exercise influence over a wide geographic area by controlling this region invited many invaders and generated plenty of conflict among the Balkan peoples themselves. A look at how the peoples who inhabited the Central Balkans before the Serbs navigated this dangerous landscape will help us better understand what the Serbs have gone through throughout their history. The first humans who settled Serbia established homes in the hills and mountains in the center and south. During the Ice Age, the Pannonian Plain in the north was barely inhabitable because there was no shelter from the harsh climate. While the south was not significantly more pleasant when it came to living conditions, numerous caves offered at least some protection from the elements. The remains of the Ice Age inhabitants of Serbia and their artifacts tell us that they survived by hunting and gathering fruits, lived in groups of up to 15 people, and made objects and tools out of flint and bone. Conditions for life remained difficult even after the end of the Ice Age. While the climate became warmer, it was unstable and the landscape was barren and swampy. However, one corner of modern-day Serbia thrived in this period. Đerdap, or Iron Gates, a gorge carved by the Danube through the Carpathian mountain chain, gave rise to the Lepenski Vir culture, named after the place where its remains were first discovered. It lasted for millennia, reaching a peak between 6,700 and 5,500 BC. The topography of the Đerdap Gorge created a perfect refuge for all manner of life during the transition between the end of the Ice Age and the Late Stone Age, when the soil became suitable for farming. The Danube was a major source of fresh water, while the varying terrain levels created different climatic zones, allowing many different species to find a home in this area. Lepenski Vir culture is revolutionary because its members were the first known inhabitants of what is now Serbia to build more or less permanent settlements, and not in a haphazard manner, but with planning and purpose. While they remained hunter-gatherers, the variety of species on land and the abundance of fish in the Danube meant that they did not have to go far to find food. Fishing was such an important part of these people's lives that it appears to have heavily influenced their religion. Namely, across the dig sites in the Đerdap Gorge associated with this culture, archaeologists have found numerous oval sculptures with fish faces. Lepenski Vir culture faded due to two closely interconnected reasons. The spread of forests and grasslands transformed the landscape of the previously sparsely populated regions, creating favorable conditions for agriculture, which was brought to the Balkans by the settlers from Asia Minor. Starčevo culture, named after a village where its remains were first discovered, thrived from 5300 to 4500 BC. The heartland of this culture was in Serbia, with branches in the neighboring countries. While Starčevo people grew plants and tended to domesticated animals, the rudimentary agricultural techniques at their disposal quickly caused the soil to be depleted. Therefore, from time to time, they had to abandon their villages and establish new ones, returning to their old homes when the land had recovered and the new land could no longer support them. For that reason, they did not build their homes to last. However, the objects they made were crafted with care, especially pottery, which was superior to that of many later cultures that came in their place. The rest of the 5th millennium and the whole of the 4th millennium BC are the age of the Vinča culture. Experts cannot agree whether it is a direct continuation of the Starčevo culture or whether it arose under the influence of a new wave of arrivals from Anatolia. It covered a similar geographic area and due to improvements in agricultural techniques, it experienced a major population expansion. It is estimated that the site after which it was named, one of the largest found, at one point housed approximately 2,500 people, which was impressive for their time. Agricultural advances allowed the Vinča people not only to multiply but also led to the improvement of living conditions compared to their Starčevo predecessors. Their houses were sturdier and more luxurious, including multiple rooms, their pottery more refined, and their trading networks extensive. Larger communities also resulted in more complex social structures. Since there was less free land to move to if the soil got depleted, effort had to be invested into keeping it productive, which resulted in a degree of job specialization and social stratification. Vinča culture appears to have been on the brink of two major developments. Objects with abstract markings found at a number of sites indicate that Vinča people may have experimented with a proto-writing system. They also dabbled in basic metallurgy. But despite these advances, they were still firmly in the Stone Age when the first Indo-European bands wielding metal weapons invaded from the east. In the Copper and Bronze Ages, rather than the core region of a sophisticated locally developed culture, Serbia was a transitional zone between major cultures centered around the Aegean, Lower Danube Valley, and Upper and Middle Danube Valley. Although the inhabitants of the Central Balkans learned to produce copper and later Bronze Age tools and weapons, other aspects of life and technology declined in quality compared to the previous age. Raiding was frequent, which meant plenty of uncertainty, and so less time was devoted to art and construction, while in agriculture, herding was preferred over tending crops. Cultures that did arise locally were usually under a strong influence of larger neighbors, covered a small geographic area, and lasted a short time in comparison to those that preceded them. The only major exception appears to have been the Vučedol culture, which started in the Srem region shared by Serbia and Croatia. Starting from the 13th and over the several following centuries, invasions and migrations from the north resulted in another turbulent period. This was a transition from the Bronze to the Iron Age, during which Indo-Europeans would become firmly established in the Balkans. The cultures of Donja Brnica, Bosut, and Glasinac thrived during this period and are believed to be the predecessors of those peoples who inhabited Serbia during the classical antiquity and whose names are recorded in Greek and Roman sources. Triballi are generally considered to have been one of the Thracian tribes, and their territory consisted of what is now eastern Serbia and northwestern Bulgaria. Instead of tending the land and maintaining their settlements, they seem to have preferred raiding their neighbors. In 424 BC, they invaded Odrysia, a fellow Thracian kingdom, while in 375 they pillaged the surroundings of Abdera, a Greek polis on the northeastern coast of the Aegean. In 344 and 43 BC, Philip II of Macedon defeated them, but it took another campaign by Alexander the Great to break their power. Western and southern Serbia were the domain of the Illyrian tribes of Autariati and Dardanians. The first focused on cattle herding because their territory was mostly mountainous. The Dardanians inhabited the southwestern and southern parts of Serbia. Due to their proximity to Greece, they were under its heavy influence and therefore more economically and culturally developed. Like the Triballi, the Dardanians also suffered at the hands of Philip II and Alexander the Great, although they managed to recover and continued fighting against Alexander's successors in Macedon. At the end of the 4th century BC, Celts appeared at the confluence of the Sava and Danube rivers, the location of Serbia's capital, Belgrade, which they developed into a settlement known as Singidunum. From there, for several decades, they conducted extensive campaigns deep into the Balkans, managing to reach central Greece, where they were finally stopped in 279 BC at the Battle of Delphi. However, it was not the end of them, as survivors who managed to return to the Sava and the Danube established a kingdom in that area and are known in the sources as Skordiski. The Romans started expanding into the Balkans after the First Punic War. At first, they cooperated with the tribes of the Central Balkans against their common enemies, the Macedonians. However, after the Romans conquered the kingdom of Macedon in 148 BC, cooperation turned into hostility since now they had to defend the newly conquered territory from their former allies. It took the Romans 150 years to subdue these tribes and establish a border on the Danube. They were motivated to control the entire course of the mighty river, since it was a natural barrier that could be utilized to protect both their possessions in Greece and the northeastern approach to Italy. The Romans built the first proper cities in the Central Balkans, and the names of some are still in use, although slightly altered. The most famous examples are Naissus, currently Niš, the birthplace of Constantine the Great and the third largest city in Serbia, and Sirmium, currently Sremska Mitrovica, after which the surrounding region is named Srem. Although the Romans improved the economy of the region by establishing cities, building roads, and opening mines, the Central Balkans was one of the less developed parts of the empire. However, the three Roman provinces that included parts of modern-day Serbia, Pannonia, Dalmatia, and Upper Mysia, were of great military importance. They were the shield of the empire against the tribes that lived across the Danube and provided some of the best troops. One of these tribes were the Dacians, who inhabited modern-day Romania. Their raids motivated Emperor Trajan to conduct two campaigns against them at the beginning of the 2nd century, which are famously depicted on Trajan's column in Rome. The preparations for these wars were extensive, and some of the infrastructure built to facilitate the transfer of large contingents of the Roman army to the left bank of the Danube in the Jerdab Gorge survives to this day, such as the foundations of a 1 kilometer long bridge between the Serbian and Romanian towns of Kladovo and Drobeta, or the famous Tabula Traiana, an inscription carved in the rocks above the Danube, which commemorates the construction of a road through the Jerdab Gorge. The next 100 years were relatively peaceful, as the newly established province of Dacia served as a buffer between the Central Balkans and the barbarians to the north. During this period, the region became firmly integrated into the Roman world. Settlers came from distant provinces such as Syria, trade flowed via the roads built along the Sava, Danube, and Morava rivers, and many locals adopted Roman customs and the Latin language. The Balkan provinces played a key role in the crisis of the 3rd century. Since several legions were stationed there and they were the main recruiting ground, they were heavily involved in the frequent and often violent changes at the head of the Roman Empire in the period between 235 and 284 AD. Out of all the emperors who were born, or are assumed to have been born, in the territory of modern-day Serbia, 6 rose to power during this turbulent period. The situation somewhat stabilized during the reign of Diocletian and his tetrarchs, one of whom, Galerius, ruled the Balkan and Pannonian provinces from Sirmium. Because Dacia was abandoned during the crisis of the 3rd century due to its exposure to barbarian attacks, extensive works were undertaken to strengthen the fortifications along the Danube. They, however, failed to stop the Goths, Huns, and other tribes during the Great Migration, serving only to slow them down. The legions stationed in the Balkans again played a crucial role during the changes on the Roman throne in the 4th century AD. First, when Constantine the Great became emperor, the Balkan peninsula was the power base of his ally and then enemy Licinius. Later, the military commanders stationed in Sirmium were involved in struggles between Constantine's successors. After the disaster at Adrianople in 376, Theodosius I was proclaimed emperor in Sirmium in 379. The following decades were marked by pillaging by various barbarians, primarily the Goths. Romans, however, managed to maintain some semblance of control. This was also the time when the Roman Empire was permanently split into the eastern and western parts. The border followed the Sava and Drina rivers to the Adriatic coast. And as we will learn throughout this series, this would not be the first time that these rivers would represent a border between empires. In the mid-5th century, the Huns made a strong push across the Danube, which resulted in the complete collapse of the Roman rule north of Naissus. Cities such as Sirmium, Singidunum, and the capital of Upper Mysia, Viminatium, today a major archaeological site, were thoroughly demolished. These territories were recovered several decades later, and Justinian invested great effort into rebuilding fortifications and cities, even establishing some new ones, such as Justiniana Prima, which he built near the place where he was born and made into the seat of the archbishop. However, his endeavors proved futile when the Avars and the Slavs appeared on the Danubian frontier, which we will cover in the next episode. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this condensed account of the history of Serbia during the prehistory and antiquity. If you are interested in learning more about the history of Serbia and the Serbian people, please subscribe. Since these videos take time to research and produce, I cannot promise a regular upload schedule, so click on the bell button to receive notifications when a new one drops. and leave a comment to stimulate the algorithm. See you in the next one.